On Tuesday, the 4th of August, Lisa Hogan walked into a restaurant kitchen somewhere in the heel of Italy's boot, pulled a bag of pasta out of her luggage, and handed it to a chef. That pasta was made from wheat grown in the Cotswolds. And the reason that is not just a cute travel story is that the very same crop, the Durham wheat she grew it from, had already failed once on that same land. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will understand why the one crop that managed to beat diddly squat is now the only thing on that farm worth talking about, and why it holds the answer to the question Clarkson's been asking about 200 acres of his own ground. If this channel is where you come when you want the numbers under the headline rather than just the headline itself, hit subscribe. Let's get into it. Start with what actually happened, because almost everyone who covered it got it wrong. The footage appeared on Instagram on the morning of Tuesday, the 4th of August. Jeremy Clarkson is sitting outside a restaurant in Puglia, that's the long flat region running down the inside of Italy's heel, visibly enjoying himself. He tells the camera that Lisa has brought pasta with her. Pasta she made herself, from the Durham wheat they grew at diddly squat. She's handed it to the restaurant kitchen and asked them to cook it. In Italy, he says, laughing at what he clearly finds to be a slightly insane idea. This is going to be good. Then the chef comes out. 3 words. Very good pasta. Now. Every single entertainment site that picked that up, and they all picked it up within about 6 hours, treated it as a stunt. British woman smuggles British pasta into Italy. Italian chef is too polite to be rude about it. Everybody has a laugh. That was the entire story as far as the entertainment press was concerned. Here is what they didn't bother to find out. Puglia is not a random corner of Italy. It is not where you go for a beach holiday and a glass of Primitivo, though you can do that too. Puglia is the single most important Durham wheat region in the entire country. It has the largest dedicated Durham wheat acreage of any Italian region. The sun beats down on that flat landscape from May through September. The soil is dry and calcium-rich, and the crop that comes off those fields underpins a vast slice of Italian pasta production. When Barilla, Divella, De Cecco, and the rest of the big pasta manufacturers talk about sourcing Italian wheat, a significant proportion of what they mean is Puglian wheat. The region produces a crop that is, quite literally, the global standard. Lisa Hogan did not take pasta to Italy. She took Cotswolds Durham wheat to the one place on earth where the people who know the most about Durham wheat live, work, and eat. And the verdict was, good pasta. That is not a nice little travel anecdote. That is a product test with a very specific and very qualified jury. So let's actually talk about Durham wheat, because this is the part that most of the coverage skipped entirely, and without it, none of the rest of this makes sense. When most people think about wheat, and most people in Britain don't think about wheat at all unless they're making a sandwich, they're thinking about bread wheat, triticum estivum, hexaploid, the stuff that goes into Hovis, into animal feed, into about 1,000 industrial uses across the food chain. That wheat is what fills most of Britain's fields. It's a workhorse. It yields well in a temperate, reasonably wet climate. It's been bred over decades to cope with British weather. Durham wheat is a different species entirely. Triticum turgidum durum, if you want the full name. The word durum is Latin for hard, as in, the endosperm of the grain is physically harder, denser, and more resistant to milling than bread wheat. That density is the point. When you grind durum, it doesn't turn into the fine powdery flour you'd use for pastry. It fractures into coarse, golden, sand-like granules. That's semolina, and semolina is what real pasta is made from. The high protein content in durum, typically between 12 and 15% in a well-grown crop, forms a gluten network when mixed with water. That network is what makes pasta hold together under heat. It's the reason bucatini keeps its hole, rigatoni keeps its ridges, and orecchiette holds its cup shape. Without that structure, pasta is just wet starch that falls apart in the pot. If you've ever cooked cheap pasta and ended up with something resembling warm mush, the culprit is almost always soft wheat, where durum should have been. In fact, Italy takes this so seriously, there's an actual law about it. Presidential Decree number 187, which mandates that dried pasta sold in Italy must be made from durum semolina and water. Using soft wheat in Italian pasta isn't a quality issue there. It's fraud. Durum also has a longer history than most people realize. The grain has been cultivated around the Mediterranean for thousands of years. It traces back to the Fertile Crescent and arrived in southern Europe via ancient trade routes long before anyone had thought to roll it into spaghetti. The Etruscans appear to have had tools suited to pasta making as far back as the 4th century BC. By the time the Italian Renaissance rolled around, pasta makers across southern Italy had worked out that semolina gave them a texture and shelf life that nothing else could replicate. The tradition in Puglia specifically runs deep enough that the town of Altamura has a bread made entirely from local Durham semolina that now carries EU-protected designation of origin status. The same grain that makes pasta in Bari is, in a slightly different form, the bread on the table in the farmhouse next door. None of that heritage exists in the Cotswolds. Durham is, at its core, a Mediterranean crop. It evolved to manage heat, to concentrate protein when the ground gets dry, to ripen fast and clean under blue skies. The British climate, on the other hand, is defined by exactly the kind of unpredictability that Durham cannot tolerate. Specifically, Durham is catastrophically vulnerable to rain in the weeks immediately before harvest. If it gets wet at the wrong moment, a chemical process kicks in that destroys its Hagberg falling number, a measure of the starch quality in the grain that millers use to assess whether the crop is actually any use. And if the Hagberg collapses, the entire milling specification fails with it. It doesn't matter how good the protein is. It doesn't matter how cleanly the crop has grown. You miss the Hagberg threshold, and you have spent a full season growing something that can only go to animal feed, at animal feed prices, after incurring the full cost of growing a specialist crop. The milling specification for pasta-grade Durham is ruthless. Protein above 13%, Hagberg falling number of at least 280 seconds, bushel weight of 78 kilograms per hectoliter. Miss any one of those three numbers, and the pasta mill won't take it. There's no partial credit, no consolation grade. You either hit the spec or you don't. And in a British summer, the rain that makes that judgment call can arrive in the space of an afternoon. This is why you don't see Durham growing across the British countryside. The handful of growers who have tried it commercially are mostly clustered along the dry eastern coastline, parts of Suffolk and Norfolk, where annual rainfall is the lowest in the country, and the east-facing aspect gives them the best shot at clean harvest conditions. Even there, it's a small and specialized niche. The economics also cut against scale. Durham typically yields fewer tons per hectare than bread wheat. The trade-off is a premium price and a specific buyer who will actually pay that premium, but only if you hit the spec. The arithmetic is fine if you hit the numbers. If you don't, you've grown less of a crop that earns less at the weighbridge. So when a farm in inland Oxfordshire, wet, clay-heavy Cotswolds, not the dry coastal margin, decides to plant Durham wheat, that is not an adventurous hobby. That is a deliberate bet against the climate. And here is where this whole story pivots, because they already made that bet once at Diddley Squat, and they lost. If you've read the back of the 4th Diddley Squat book, Home to Roost, Clarkson lists the failures of that particular season with a kind of exhausted frankness. Spring barley failed, oilseed rape failed, and the Durham wheat failed. He put it in print. The crop that was supposed to give them something to actually sell went wrong, and it went wrong the way Durham goes wrong in Britain. Probably wet at the wrong moment, or simply unable to hit specification in a year that didn't give them the weather they needed. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it completely changes what happened in Puglia. This was not a farm stumbling into something new and getting lucky. This was a farm that had already tried Durham, watched it fail, put it in a book, and then went back and grew it again. And this time got something good enough to carry across Europe in a suitcase and hand to a chef in the world's most qualified Durham growing region. Nobody covering the Italy story has connected those two facts. That gap, the failed crop and the pasta on the table in Puglia, is the actual story. So why did it work this time when it went wrong before? The answer is the season. And the season, in 2026, has been extraordinary. AJHDB published their first harvest report for 2026 on the 31st of July, the earliest they've ever released that report since they started collecting the data in 2006. Growers across the south and east of England were combining in mid-July. Some were running through the night to get ahead of the daytime heat. The 2026 harvest is officially the earliest on record. The numbers tell the rest. National average feed wheat yield came in at 6.8 tons per hectare, 13% below the 5-year average. 90% of surveyed farms came in below their own 5-year figure. That's not a bad year. That's a structurally failed crop for the overwhelming majority of British arable growers. Hot, dry, short of rain when the plants needed to fill grain, early to ripen because the heat forced the season on faster than anyone planned for. Now apply that same season to Durham, and the picture inverts completely. The same heat that forced bread wheat to ripen before it had properly filled grain drove protein concentration in the durum, because the plant, under moisture stress, puts more energy into protein rather than starch. That's a well-documented physiological response in Durham. The drier the finish, the higher the protein in the grain. The same high temperatures that killed Hagberg falling numbers in exposed bread wheat crops gave Durham a clean, fast finish with no rain to trigger pre-harvest germination. The dry harvest that the East Coast Durham growers have been chasing for years arrived in 2026 across a much wider swathe of the country than usual, including the Cotswolds. For one season, the Cotswolds grew its crop under something closer to Puglian conditions. The crop that had failed when Britain was being Britain came good when Britain accidentally became the Mediterranean for 6 weeks. Now let's talk about money, because that's what this channel is for. Here is the position on ordinary feed wheat heading into harvest. The November 2026 UK feed wheat futures contract has been trading around 196.5 per ton. That sounds like a reasonable number until you set it against what Oxfordshire calculated as the full economic cost of growing a ton of wheat in 2026, £1,659 per hectare. Run that division, and you need approximately 8.44 tons per hectare just to cover costs. The national average this year is 6.8 tons. At 6.8 tons and £196.50 a ton, you are looking at revenues of roughly £1,336 per hectare against a cost of £1,659. That is a loss of over £300 per hectare before you factor in any abnormal costs, machinery failures, contractors, anything unexpected. That's not a margin squeeze. That's a systematic negative return on the land. This is the arithmetic that explains why Clarkson left 200 acres of diddly squat unplanted this season. It wasn't a decision made out of laziness or despair. It was arithmetic done in advance. Put those 200 acres into feed wheat at 2026 yields and 2026 prices, and you are actively destroying money with every acre you plant. Leaving it empty costs you the fixed overheads, the rent or mortgage on the land, the depreciation on machinery standing idle, but it doesn't add another £300 per hectare loss on top. Sometimes not doing something is the better version of doing something. That's a hard argument to make on television without sounding defeatist, but the numbers back it up completely. Now here is the structural argument for Durham, and it's not the obvious one. I'm not going to stand here and tell you Durham wheat sells at some enormous multiple of feed wheat, because I haven't been able to find a reliable current UK Farmgate Durham price, and I'm not in the business of making up numbers. What I can tell you is that Durham commands a premium at milling. Science Direct research puts it at potentially up to 50% over soft wheat for grain that hits full specification, but that premium exists only if the spec is met, and we've already talked about how demanding that spec is. The bigger structural argument isn't about the price of the wheat at all, it's about what Diddley Squad is doing with it. They're not selling wheat, they're selling pasta. There is no futures contract for pasta. There is no November 2026 pasta contract trading on the exchange. Nobody rings up a farm in Chipping Norton and tells them the price has dropped £12 a ton overnight because the Canadian harvest came in better than expected and the buyer's now looking at alternatives. The pasta margin doesn't move because it's raining in the Black Sea shipping lanes. When you're a wheat grower, the commodity market sets your price. You have no influence over it. You can hedge it forward, you can time your sales, but ultimately, the price is what the market decides it is. Shaped by production in Russia, Ukraine, Argentina, Canada, the US, and about 15 other countries whose weather you cannot predict or control. When you sell a bag of pasta with your farm's name on it, you set the price. That's not a nuance. That is the entire difference between the 200 empty acres and the bag Lisa carried into that kitchen. Same farm, same soil, same season. One of them is exposed to a global commodity market that has decided, for structural reasons, that British wheat is not currently worth growing. The other one isn't in that market at all. And this is where Lisa Hogan's record becomes relevant, because she has done this move before. Repeatedly, across completely different product categories. The diddly squat product range, and it has become a range, with distribution that now extends well beyond the farm shop near Chipping Norton, has a consistent logic underneath all of it. Take something the farm produces, or something the farm's name can carry, and get it out of the commodity version of that market into something where the brand, not the exchange, determines the price. The candles, including the one whose name got written up by entertainment journalists around the world at no cost to the business, are not competing with commodity candles. They're competing as a diddly squat product, which is a different category entirely. The Lion's Mane mushroom supplements sit in a premium wellness niche, not in the commodity mushroom trade. The crisps, the condiments, the collaboration with Emma Bridgewater on ceramic mugs, every single one of them is the same underlying move made in a different aisle. She's even written a book about the farm shop year, which is itself a form of brand extension that generates attention for the product range without requiring additional marketing spend. The Diddly Squat brand relaunch earlier this year, new logo, new identity built around a cockerel with a pitchfork, the rallying call of "for farm's sake," was explicitly designed to carry that logic further. The message was, this is a brand that backs British farming, that sources within 16 miles, that puts the farmer's name on the product and means it. That positioning doesn't just make the pasta more interesting, it makes every product in the range more defensible, because the story underneath it is consistent. You're not buying generic pasta. You're buying a story about a farm in Oxfordshire that grew a Mediterranean crop in a British summer and then took it to Italy to find out if it was any good. The Italian chef said it was. And every article written about a chef in Puglia approving Cotswold's pasta is a 5-star review she didn't have to pay for. It is free positioning at a global scale. Now let me be fair, because this channel doesn't do one-sided arguments. There is a reasonable objection to all of this. It goes like this. One successful harvest doesn't prove anything. The Durham at Diddly Squat failed in a normal British year and came good in an exceptional one, the earliest, hottest, driest harvest in recorded Ochtib history. That's not a farming strategy. That's a coincidence. Get a normal July next year, or a wet June, and the crop goes back to the feed heap at feed prices. The investment in drilling, establishment, and fungicide program, because Durham does need a robust fungicide program, and a late nitrogen application to push protein, is the same whether the weather cooperates or not. That's a completely fair point. Durham has consistently failed to establish itself as a mainstream UK arable crop for exactly this reason. The East Coast growers who've done it commercially have done it on the driest, most sheltered ground in the country, usually with a specific mill on their doorstep that wanted the grain. A 1,000-acre Oxfordshire farm, growing it across any significant area, is taking a real gamble on British summer weather behaving itself. The 2026 season is a genuine outlier. Whether it's the start of a climate trend, hotter, drier summers becoming the norm as climate change shifts the UK's seasonal patterns southward, is a question that needs more than one data point to answer. But notice what that objection doesn't touch. Even if the Durham fails again next season, the thing that Lisa built around it doesn't go away. The pasta exists. The brand carries it. The chef's endorsement is on the record and cannot be unsaid. And the underlying commercial logic, get out of the commodity market and sell something with your name on it, is valid whatever the crop is. She's already demonstrated that with mushroom supplements, with candles, with a product range that generated its own press coverage. The Durham is the experiment. The strategy underneath it is established. And there's a separate, broader point here about where British farming is headed. Climate science is not simple, and individual seasons can't be used as proof of long-term trends. But the conditions that made 2026 so difficult for bread wheat are exactly the conditions that would, if they persist or become more frequent, favor crops like Durham that are adapted to heat and dry. Some research on climate change and Durham wheat has suggested that shifting growing regions northward is a genuine possibility as Mediterranean summers become hotter and less predictable. Britain growing a crop that currently comes overwhelmingly from Canada, the US, France, and southern Italy is not, in the long run, an absurd idea. It's worth watching. Here is where it all lands. A few weeks ago on this channel, we covered 200 acres of diddly squat that were deliberately left empty because at current prices and current yields, the numbers on putting a crop in don't work. That was the bleakest farming story of the British summer, and it came from the most visible farm in the country. Then on Tuesday the 4th of August, from that same farm, in that same season, grown from that same soil, a bag of pasta walked into a restaurant in Puglia, and a chef called it very good. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the distance between them is the entire argument about the future of British arable farming. Grow the commodity, and the market decides whether you break even. Grow something with your name on it, and you decide. 200 acres of nothing, and a bag of pasta in Puglia. Same farm, same year, opposite ends of the same problem. Here's what I want from you in the comments. And I want something specific, not general. If you farm arable ground, would you put Durham in this coming autumn after the summer we've just had? Yes or no? And one line on the reasoning. I want to know whether growers are reading 2026 as a one-time freak or as a preview of something they need to start planning around. If you're not a farmer, would you pay more for pasta made from British wheat than for the imported bag sitting next to it on the shelf? Because that question, not the weather in the Cotswolds, not the price at the mill, but what you decide in a supermarket aisle, is the only thing that ultimately makes this model work. And if you're watching from Canada, the US, Australia, or anywhere in the Mediterranean that actually grows Durham at scale, what do you make of a farm in Oxfordshire having a go? I'd genuinely like to hear that. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.